I thought it would just be nice for us to have a bit of a chat and see what comes up around topics that I think both of us are quite interested in. So decision-making skills and kind of navigating complexity.
Yeah.
It's something that I think we've both been interested in prior to 2020, but I think it seems to be even more timely now because, you know, we've got that very clear example of complexity working through a world where there seems to be less value on predictions and the tried and tested, and much more value on coming up with these new emergent solutions, pivoting, you know, adjusting regularly. So when we talk about complexity, I think that can mean different things to different people. You know, like I hadn't really considered the, you know, say like a complicated problem could be very different to a complex problem until I heard your talk actually in the EMCC a while back. So I suppose to start off, what do you think characterizes complexity? How does it maybe differ to, say, a complicated or a simple problem?
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I think that's a great place to start. And I think you're right, just something you said there about like 2020 brought with us a huge insight as to what it's like to live in a very complex world where things are changing and things are unpredictable. And I think that's the real key here. That and if you think of the as you mentioned the talk I did, I was drawing on this Cynefin framework, which was put together by Dave Snowden, who's formerly of IBM, as a way of making sense of the world. And like he divides the world into predictable and unpredictable, really, and that's it. And unfortunately, a lot of us are presented with very simple solutions. And, you know, even at the moment, like if people come up with, well, it's obvious what we need to do. It's this, this is the thing we have to do. But that only works if you got a simple problem. And a simple problem is where there is an answer. You know, there is an actual answer. You say, that is how you do this. We've all agreed. And a complicated problem is where maybe there are multiple answers, but yet any of them would work. So we think of things like the example I always give is, you know, we say you're putting it as it was, you know, a man on the moon. That was very complicated, but I mean, they could do it again and again. It was Apollo 11, so they had plenty of other times to try things out, and then they could repeat them. So you know, it's like, you know, you can do something, you know, it's going to work, and you can do it again and again. That's can be very complicated, but there's repeatability, and by analyzing, you can predict the future. And that's where, you know, we say engineers and scientists spend a lot of their work. But when you get into the complex world, that's where there isn't predictability, because no matter how much we analyze the past, we can't really predict the future. And if you take something like, you know, when we deal with people, like that's the one thing that's predictable about us, is that we are unpredictable. You know? We're even unpredictable and particularly in our decision making, that like we're not even predictable during the course of a day. Like a lot of the research shows that, you know, a decision you might make in the morning when you're nice and, you know, you're maybe awake and alive and you've had a bit of a walk and everything, and you're the same decision that you're faced with later on in the day when you're tired and your sugar levels are low, you make a completely different decision. So we're like, anytime we deal with human beings, we're going to be dealing with unpredictability and human behavior. And if you think of where we are with COVID, like trying to predict human behavior and response can be really, really difficult. So yeah, so when we think of complexity, I think we always have to think, is this predictable or not? If it's not predictable, we're definitely in a complex world, and we have to look at, as you said, emergent solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I often think that when, you know, you hear sometimes people going, oh, the government don't know what they're doing. It's like, of course they don't. Like, it's not surprising that they don't. Like, it's not that they're incompetent or stupid, not necessarily. It's just that there isn't a correct answer. And we can, you know, we can say, oh, this worked in this country, so we need to just copy it. Different country. So, you know.
And that is the biggest mistake. The biggest mistake that's made is that people think, because they confuse something that's analyzable with something that's predictable. Just because you can analyze something does not mean you can predict it. So, I mean, everyone is able to analyze a football match when the match is over. Everyone can tell you how, you know, Man United scored X number of goals. That's easy to do because you have all the evidence there, and it has happened. But if you ask them to predict up front, you know, in what minute will the first goal be scored, you know, that now is into Paddy Power bookmakers territory.
Exactly.
So yeah, so we can always analyze, and this is, and maybe you might maybe share, I know you're very interested in things like bias. That's where hindsight bias comes in, where we, in retrospect, we can all look back and say, oh yeah, I know exactly how I got here.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have been able to tell up front. And I know you got your own angle on like how we think about and personality and that. Maybe you might tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think I'm quite interested in that role that personality plays in just how we see the world and how we make decisions.
Yeah.
I think it can sometimes be overlooked. You know, we assume that we're all operating with the same information or from the same kind of standpoint or biases, but not really recognizing that how we see the world, how we interpret that information, how we make decisions, how we take risks. There's a kind of, you know, there's a level going on underneath that we might not be fully aware of.
Yeah.
For example, you know, if we were looking at personality and say the, you know, extroversion, someone who's higher in this, you know, more extroverted might be much more comfortable making decisions as part of a group, whereas someone who's more introverted probably prefers, you know, appreciates that time to think things through, then come up with a solution with the group. If we think of, say, you know, agreeableness, if someone's higher in that, they tend to prefer that harmony. They're trying to avoid conflict. I suppose a potential downside of that could be they might avoid voicing their opinions or getting their point across directly in the hopes of remaining diplomatic.
Yeah.
Someone who's highly conscientious, they'd prefer to have a plan, be organized, think things through. They'd be less comfortable with that on-the-fly decision making.
Yeah.
If we think of another trait is openness to experience. I suppose people who score high in that, they tend to be more curious and imaginative, and they have that need for variety. And so they might make decisions that favor change or novelty, even just for the sake of change. Whereas someone who's the opposite, you know, very low on that openness to experience, they're probably preferring the tried and tested methods. Yeah. They like to, you know, learn from the past and use that past experience to inform their decisions. And then I'm going through the big five in my
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to pick you up because you mentioned risk, because that's something I'm really curious about. Because if you think about a complex world, as I've described it, where like there's a level of unpredictability, so therefore there's going to be a risk. It's not like the simple thing where there is a solution. Yeah, I know how to do this. So how does risk affect the way I make a decision, either individually or collectively?
Yeah, it does, I think, have a huge impact, especially like we said, in that complex world where kind of every decision involves some level of risk. There's some level of unknown and unknowability. So I use the risk type compass as kind of a framework or a psychometric assessment, because it just allows you to explore that human side of risk, which I think was kind of previously unexplored areas of risk. We used to kind of go, okay, we need to rely on maybe statistics or the, you know, the procedures and policies, and you have these kind of risk mitigation strategies. Yeah. But like we said, that kind of misses the element of the person who's making those decisions. So the risk type compass, it doesn't capture all aspects of our personality, but it does help us understand, you know, themes such as how naturally resilient we are, our natural preference towards change and unfamiliarity, how we perceive and take and manage risks. And that can obviously have huge implications for making decisions in a complex world, because it can allow us to identify those potential strengths or potential pitfalls with each type. And when you better understand that, say, about yourself, you know, you can then understand, okay, how do I leverage my strengths, or do I need to develop skills and strategies in order to be more effective? And then when used with teams, the team can then be aware of their group strengths or group limitations. They can seek out diversity, you know, not just diversity being what we can see, but, you know, difference of personality and how we see the world. I think with a greater understanding and awareness of different personality types, I think it can reduce conflict, like negative conflict. It can probably improve creativity and problem solving. So there'd be researchers to suggest that, you know, diversity can help problem solving and decision making when there's efforts made to actually acknowledge and celebrate diversity. If you just throw a group of people together and be like, off you go, you know, you're going to get one person who sees the world a particular way and goes, why is this other person, you know, doing it this way? That's just so wrong and so different to how I do it. So I think that kind of awareness, you know, like, I'm sure like we've all had those kind of experiences. Like, say if, you know, if someone is naturally very kind of optimistic and resilient, they might be frustrated when they're working with someone who they perceive as pessimistic. But actually, if there was an awareness, they could say, well, that person is really great at spotting potential threats that I missed. They're great at kind of scanning the environment for threats, because they're naturally geared towards doing that. So if there's that awareness, you can kind of leverage it off quite well, I think.
I think the piece around group decision making is really interesting, because like that's something that has always fascinated me. Like, you know, when I look and say, how did all those really intelligent people sit around the table and make a really stupid decision, you know, or multiple ones? And it's really fascinating, the whole area, whether it's, you know, we say the people have a groupthink, but it was even broader than that. You said it's even down to personality pieces, it feeds into it, risk feeds into it. I think the social norming, you know, watching what everyone else around the room is doing, you know, so, you know, someone throws out an idea and you notice other people are nodding. Are you going to be the one who's not going to nod? So all of this stuff goes on. I think so. Group dynamics is, and you're right, just putting a group of diverse people together is never enough. You've got to figure out, how am I going to leverage the diversity, and how do we make sure that you can go back to diversity of risk appetite, you know, like, so some people might take a higher level of risk than others. How do you blend all that together so we don't end up making really, really poor decisions? And I always think as well that there's a really important differentiation between poor decision making and poor decision outcomes. Like you can always have a poor outcome for all sorts of reasons, but you have no excuse for poor decision making. You've got control of that. You know, things may change in the meantime. So really putting effort into your decision making is where you really, that's where the benefit is. If you want to improve your decision making, that's where you start. And there's never enough either just to look at your decision outcomes in isolation, because some of them have worked out just by pure luck. And some of them will have worked out because of good decision-making process. So but that piece of group decision-making, I think, is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that's, and you can say there's lots of biases come in there as well, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned there about, you know, groupthink, and if everyone's nodding along, it's, you know, that's really natural for us to want to, you know, we're kind of tribal kind of things that want to be part of the group and we want to fit in. But it can then lead to kind of, you know, not effective decision making. But you're mentioning there about, you know, how do intelligent people make what seem to be stupid decisions? Do you have any sort of insight into that?
Well, actually, it's interesting. A lot of people are saying, you know, about Zoom, you know, and Teams, and we're all working virtually. How, you know, and okay, some of the research would say yes, it can be more difficult to have group decision making when you are virtually, because it's harder to read the room, it's harder to manage conflict, it's harder to build relationships. So like the research is there on that. However, I would say you should take advantage of the technology, because the great thing you can do, as we all know from using Teams and Zoom, is you can break up your group very easily now into smaller groups. So if you've got a group of 12 people making a decision, 3 groups of 4 working individually, now you've already helped by breaking up the social norming that's going on. So you now have smaller groups working, and then let them individually come back. The other thing you can do, and this is something we don't, and you spoke earlier about the introverts, you can actually provide one, you know, individual time. You can literally say to everyone, right, everyone goes to an individual breakout room and spends the next 15 minutes on this issue and comes back.
Yeah.
So I think we can use the technology, knowing that all of us together in the room sometimes gets in our way. And let's use the technology. We're forced into a virtual setting. So that's one thing we can do. Just break up our meetings a bit, maybe give the interest a bit more time, and even use things like anonymous polling if we have to. So we're not waiting to see how everyone else is voting. So there's a few things we can use from a technology to help us in that. So that's a couple of tips I'd throw out there.
Yeah, I think those are great tips. Yeah, I suppose, like, going back to what you mentioned about being aware of decision-making process rather than the outcomes. Yeah. I think having that sort of, I think you've mentioned it before, the decision-making journal.
Yeah.
Some way of recording what was your process for making that decision. Or I'd even say, you know, if you are, say, faced with a really difficult decision, you know, imagine you've lots of options, you're trying to, you've narrowed it down to a few options, but none of them seem quite perfect. There are these big consequences at stake, and you're worried about making the wrong decision. That can sometimes, you know, cause that indecisiveness because you're kind of paralyzed, you're afraid to go any direction. But what I think is useful is you can create a list. And it's similar to that decision-making journal, but just listing all the reasons of why you were choosing to make this decision in this particular way at this particular time. So then later on, even if it doesn't go well, you can come back to that list and say, okay, well, at that time, with the information I had, that was the best decision I could make. And I think that can stop the sort of regret from creeping in. Or, you know, if people maybe lack this confidence in their decision-making capabilities, they can kind of come back to that and say, look, it's okay that it didn't work out perfectly, but I did the best I could. And so it can tackle all of those things like lack of confidence or hindsight bias, where we think we made a bad decision because of bad outcomes, or vice versa. I think the list as well can be important to come back to when emotions are heightened. You know, like, when emotions kind of, it's like if the emotions go up, you're angry, you're upset, or like you mentioned, you're tired, your sugar levels are low, logic can kind of go out the window a bit. So it's very easy to ignore that logic when emotions are heightened. But coming back to the logical list, it can kind of balance things out a bit. So
I love that point. I mean, it's a great one. It's one that I always recommend, and I do it myself, is as individual decision making, is asking yourself, am I in the right headspace to make this decision? Like, is this really the right time to make this? Should I sleep on it? Should I go for a walk? Can I do it? Sometimes, obviously, you've got to make the decision now, regardless. But it's a really good thing. It's just asking yourself. That's the emotionally intelligent way to do this.
Exactly.
Am I in the right place? And it could be because, you know, if you're feeling low, you may overemphasize negative aspects. If you're on a high in a really, you know, zoomed up, you may be actually overemphasizing the positives. So a more neutral aspect might be a better place to be. So just being aware of where you are emotionally and asking yourself the question, is this, the emotional state I'm in, going to help me with this decision, or is it going to work against me? Even stopping to ask yourself that question is a really good thing to do. So that's another tip.
Exactly. Yeah, we're full of tips. And even that, you know, like at the moment, I think we're like, you know, we've a thermometer in the house, we're kind of taking our temperature more regularly. It's like taking your emotional temperature, you know, checking in. And it's like you said, sometimes you do have to make a decision, you know, right now, but at any point you can take 3 deep breaths, you know, regardless of how quickly you need to make the decision. You can pause for 10 seconds and just check in and say, okay, what's going on? Oh, my heart's racing. Am I excited? Am I nervous? What's happening there? Where's that coming from? You know, and what's that telling me? What impact is that going to have on how I behave?
I mean, a great example is given is like if you're doing something like a risk assessment, you're actually better off to do it if you're in a low mood because you're looking for risk. So, you know, for kind of a risk assessment, like going in when you've just been given a promotion or something and you're on the top of the world, you're probably not going to spot risks as much. Whereas if you're going to do something like, you know, you really are looking at innovation, you do want to be you know, I suppose emotionally positive and high energy for that. So you're right, just checking in. And if you find, well, this mood currently isn't working for me, figuring out a way to shift your mood is also really useful. So what David Caruso calls matching mood to task is really important for us to do.
Yeah, it's a really good one to mention. So I suppose, is there any, we've talked about having a decision-making journal and those lists, emotional intelligence, the kind of impact that has. Do you have any other, I suppose, useful tips or things that you've picked up along the way, or maybe that you've helped your clients or other leaders work on?
Yeah, well, just a final one, and it's in the decision journal, depending on how you use this, but a couple of things I think that are really worth doing when you're making a decision is to write down for yourself at the time you're making a decision, what do you think the range of outcomes are likely to be? Because it isn't going to be, unless it's a simple decision, there isn't an outcome. Your kind of best and worst case, and your most likely. It's really useful information because it gets you to think about, okay, what's the worst case based on this? What's the best case and what's the most likely? So that in itself is really good to help you focus on the range of outcomes. And also afterwards, because the whole point of doing this kind of reflection is that after the decision, a couple of months down the road, you look back, how accurately did you predict? Like if you're finding that your predictions are way off, there's something not quite right with your decision making. But if you're finding that when you look back and say, you know what, I'm not exactly at what the most expected, or my expected case, but it was within the range of what I thought it was going to be. That's really useful. And the second thing I would always encourage people to record are the options that they looked at and decided not to go with, and the reason they rejected them at the time. And the reason they rejected them is the really important one. Because as you said, with hindsight afterwards, if something hasn't worked out, we say, oh yeah, I should have gone with the other option. There was an X or a Y and I went with Y. Why did I do that? You can look back and say, well, look at the reason I rejected X for the following reasons. And you might look and say, actually, you know what? Those are actually valid reasons. So those are two things I think are really worth doing. You can feed them into your decision journal, but even if you're not doing a decision journal, I think those are really important things to record when you are making a decision. So that's my final tip of the day for me. What about you, Julie? What's your last tip to share with us?
Oh, I feel like I have a few.
Okay, I'll give you more than one.
I'm trying to think now what's the best one, but it's kind of touching on what you're saying there, but even just reminding yourself that you're not objective and you have biases. I think that, that can be a problem in itself, is if we assume I'm completely objective, I have no biases here. Like, our brains love taking shortcuts. They want to save power, they want to fill in gaps and seek out patterns. And it does that with no real effort on our part. So it's easy to forget that we're doing this automatically because we're just, designed to not to know how little we know, as it Kahneman would put it, but so I suppose even just reminding yourself, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just questioning it, keeping an open mind. I think that will be a tip in particular. When some people, they might find once they set their mind on something, they just will not let that go. They're kind of saying, and like that can be an asset. It can be brilliant, but it might also mean that if someone else comes up with a different solution, that they might dismiss that, or they could take it personally that people don't agree with them, so I suppose with that tip, it's kind of like a healthy amount of doubt. It's not saying constantly doubt yourself and always go with someone else's idea. It's just kind of saying, if you remind yourself that you're coming from a place of, subjectivity, bias, emotion, your own upbringing, culture, all these different things are having an impact. If we're reminding ourselves of that, it can just remind us that we need to be open-minded. There are alternative solutions that could be effective.
I love it. I really like that. I mean, that's like, we're not as rational as we think we are. And maybe come back to something even where you started off about how we look at the world, like the way the saying is, like, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. So that's a starting point. So exactly. I really enjoyed this discussion, Julie. I'm hoping my decision making for the rest of the day has benefited from this.